We are at the 1959 Candidates Tournament, and a young 16-year-old Bobby Fischer is having a really tough time. He has to face Mikhail Tal in 4 games, and in the first 3, he has already been convincingly crushed by the magician from Riga. According to what Kasparov tells in My Great Predecessors, this made Fischer swear in public that in this 4th game, he would take revenge on Mikhail Tal. So, what was the result of this drama? If you do not know how it ends, stay with us, because today we are going to relive this thrilling battle and, on top of that, the elegant tease Tal pulled on Fischer. For this 4th encounter, Fischer has the white pieces and opens with his usual 1e4. And at this very moment, one of the most famous anecdotes in chess history takes place. As we see in the footage, the magician from Riga pretends he is going to play the Caro-Kann defense. But that is not Tal's style, so he keeps pushing the pawn all the way to c5, the aggressive Sicilian defense. Fischer's reaction to this little bit of trolling really says it all. To face this defense, Bobby usually went for the open Sicilian. He would develop his knight to f3, and, after d6, he would strike in the center with d4. The pawns are exchanged, the knight recaptures, then black plays knight to f6, attacking the pawn on e4, which is defended by knight to c3, and Mikhail Tal chooses the move a6, entering the Najdorf variation. To face this variation, at the end of his career, Fischer used the English attack, a system that is even more popular nowadays. In this video, I will tell you what that setup is all about. But in this game, when he was still very young, only 16 years old, he preferred the move bishop to c4, the move that really carries his signature, the Fischer-Sozin attack. The idea behind this attack is to put pressure along this diagonal, so black tries to block it with the move e6. At this point, the bishop can soon be chased away with b5. On top of that, it is undefended. Let us pay very close attention to this detail of the loose piece, because it will be crucial in this game. We will see it later on. For that reason, in this line, before continuing the attack, white plays the prophylactic move bishop to b3. In any case, black plays b5, and white's attack continues with f4. The idea of this move is to follow up with f5, trying to activate the bishop along this diagonal and break open the pawn shelter around the black king. Now, without a doubt, the best plan for black would be to keep developing with a move like bishop to b7. However, at this time, the theory of this variation was only just starting to take shape, and Mikhail Tal chooses something that is very typical of his style. First, he pushes the b pawn to b4, driving the knight away. The knight moves to a4, and then black captures the pawn on e4, a decision that turns out to be extremely risky. After this, white castles, and black knows that the strong pawn thrust f5 is coming, so they try to prevent it by playing g6. But that turns out to be an illusion, because black will not really be able to stop it. The pawn will still advance to f5, and that move is very strong. The best defense for black is actually to accept the offer, so the Soviet player captures with the g-pawn. After that, Fischer's active play continues with a knight sacrifice on f5, another powerful move. Bobby clearly wants revenge for those 3 previous defeats against Mikhail Tal. To begin with, what happens if the knight is taken? Well, if that happens, the pawn on f7 comes under threat, and the rook on a8 is left undefended, so white would play queen to d5 with a double attack. This would force black to defend with the only move, rook to a7. And now let me ask you something. How do we win against this move? Well, in this case, do not calculate yet. First, let us just look at the board. This rook is undefended, and this other rook is also undefended. That is why white wins with queen to d4, creating another double attack. Keep in mind this theme of undefended pieces, because it will become even more important later on. So, for that reason, and if we go back to the position, Mikhail Tal decided not to capture the knight on f5, and instead moved the rook to g8. Now the knight on e4 is undefended, and the rook on a8 is also undefended, which is why Fischer continued with bishop to d5, another strong move. If, for example, the bishop were captured, the queen would recapture, attacking the rook and at the same time attacking the knight, recovering the material and keeping the advantage. That is why the magician from Riga once again refuses to take the piece and instead decides to move the rook to a7. The knight on e4 is captured, and in order to restore material balance, black also has to capture the knight on f5, after which the bishop recaptures. At this point, white has obtained a large advantage because we can clearly see how all of black's pawns have become weak. On top of that, the pawn shelter around the black king has been shattered, and the king will remain stuck in the center of the board, under siege from the white pieces. But let us not forget that the black pieces are being handled by Mikhail Tal. And if you want to understand why he is known as the magician from Riga, it is precisely because he is able to find hidden resources and escape from positions that are even worse than this one. For the moment, Tal continues with rook e7, bringing the rook closer to the defense of his king. After this, the bishops are exchanged and the queen recaptures. And now we reach the most critical moment of the entire game. In this position, Fischer should have played c3, a strong move, and in a moment we will understand why. But instead of that, and let us go back one move, white decided to develop the bishop to f4, which is an oversight and a tactical mistake. Why is this move a tactical error? Well, let us break it down. The square g2 is being attacked, but at the same time it is also defended by the king. And just like in mathematics, 1 minus 1 equals 0. So that means the g2 square is essentially undefended. And in addition, the knight on a4 is also undefended. And undefended pieces create tactical motifs. So, what move did Mikhail Tal find? Exactly. Queen to c6, creating a double attack. One against the g2 square with a mate threat, and the other against the undefended piece on a4. The magician from Riga has just pulled one of his tricks, and it seems that the revenge Fischer promised will have to wait. This is why white should have played c3 earlier, so that the knight would have been protected. Fischer now defends the threat on g2 by developing the queen to f3, after which the knight is captured. White is now a piece down. The bishop captures the pawn on d6, threatening both the rook and the knight. But after this, Mikhail Tal once again finds the strongest move in the position. He brings the queen back to c6. The idea is that if the bishop captures the knight, black replies with queen to b6 check, and after the king moves, Tal recovers the piece on b8. Even though the king remains trapped in the center of the board, black has an extra piece, which compensates for this weakness. Now, this is the moment when the famous psychological duel between both players took place. According to Mikhail Tal himself, Bobby Fischer wrote the move rook to e1 on his score sheet, doing it very deliberately to see his opponent's reaction. Tal says he knew this was the strongest move in the position, and as Stockfish shows us today, he was absolutely right. So the magician from Riga pulled another one of his tricks. He put on a poker face, even smiled as if he were pleased, and went for a relaxed stroll around the playing hall. During all that time, Tal explains, Bobby was not actually calculating variations, but carefully watching his reaction. And when he finally came back to the board, Fischer crossed out the move he had written before and instead decided to play queen to c6. Later on, when the game had finished, Tal asked him why he had changed the move. Fischer answered that he did it because he saw him laugh when he noticed the move written on the score sheet. The magician from Riga had also won the psychological battle. The rook blocks the check by moving to d7. Now the white rook does come to e1 to give check, but this time the bishop moves to e7. According to the engine, white's last real chance here was to play queen to f6, but instead, Fischer chooses something much more human. He sacrifices the rook on f7. The idea is that after the king captures it, Fischer will give a check on e6 and then recover one of the two rooks. Now Mikhail Tal has to move the king, but where does he go? If he goes to e8, white would answer with queen takes rook, checkmate. If instead he goes to g7, white captures the rook on d7 and the bishop on e7 will be pinned. So the black king finds the only move that saves him, stepping to f8, a good move. The rook is then captured, and the queen comes back to defend on d6. Of course, white does not want to trade queens, so he moves his queen to b7, after which Mikhail Tal plays rook to g6. At this point, I want to pause so we can notice something very important. Let us look at how all of Black's pieces are coordinated and defending each other. This is a key trait of strong players, and it is something we really need to learn. The game continued with Fischer playing c3, after which Tal replied with a5. Then came a check with the queen on c8, and the king moved to g7. The white queen went back to c4, and the bishop moved to d8. Once again, we can see how Black has everything defended. Fischer then continued by exchanging the pawns on b4, and, in order to prevent a possible bishop to c7 threatening mate on h2, they advanced the pawn on g3. But this allows Black to play queen to c6 check and force an exchange of queens. And the problem with this is that, once we reach the end game, both the bishop and the king, the two pieces that we're defending, will now join the attack. Fischer decides to block the check by bringing the rook to e4. The queens are immediately exchanged. And now, in order to defend the pawn on b4, the black rook moves to b6. Now, the most important concept in any endgame is to activate the king. So the white king steps to g2, the black king comes to f6, and the march continues with king to f3, king to e5, and king to e3. Then the bishop gives check on g5, the king returns to e2, the black king moves to d5 attacking the rook, and the white king steps to d3 to defend it, after which the bishop goes to f6, threatening the pawn on b2. At this point, perhaps the best move for white was to push the pawn to b3, but instead, Fischer decides to pull the rook back to c2 in order to defend it. After that, Black makes a series of maneuvers until we reach the moment when Fischer plays a3, offering the pawn trade, something that would suit him very well. But of course, Tal correctly refuses this and pushes the pawn to b3. Now, if the white rook stays on any square of the second rank to defend the pawn, Black will play rook to f1 and then swing the rook over to b1 to capture the pawn. Notice that the white king cannot step in to defend. So white decides to activate the rook, bringing it all the way up to c8. After this, Mikhail Tal captures the pawn on b2, and Fischer's terrible nightmare, losing for the fourth time in a row against his Soviet rival, is about to become a reality. In his last desperate attempt, Fischer decides to give a check on d8. The king steps back to c6, and now he brings the rook to b8, attacking the pawn. But Mikhail Tal replies with a rook check on f3, defending it. The king moves to c4, and, after that, the magician from Riga keeps checking with the rook on c3. The king steps back to b4, and then the black king retreats to c7, attacking the rook. After the rook moves to b5, Tal plays bishop to a1, clearing the way for the pawn to march down the board and promote, and there is no longer any way to stop it. On the next move, the American player decides to resign. With this victory, Mikhail Tal has beaten Fischer for the fourth time in a row. It is said that later on, when someone asked him for an autograph, he also signed with Fischer's name and joked, "I have beaten Bobby so many times, that gives me the right to sign for him as well." Tal's final bit of trolling. Only between great friends as they were can you treat each other like that. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you in the next video.